Today we're going to get into the actual course of the Chinese Civil War in Phase 1, which lasted from 1927 until 1937. In the previous recording, we mentioned the initial or the immediate cause to the Chinese Civil War was when the GMD pursued the CCP into the mountains. The CCP had been targeted for slaughter by Jiang Jieshi and his GMD forces, who were trying to wipe out communists not only in the GMD, but then to outright attack the CCP. Jiang Jieshi wanted the GMD to be the legit government of China and for himself to be in charge, and so to accomplish that objective, he had to get rid of the communist influence, who were starting to draw more popular support from peasants and industrial workers. So when the CCP fled into the mountains, they did so into the Jiangxi region. So this territory that they took hold in became known as Jiangxi Soviet, and that right there kind of shows you the involvement of the Soviet Union and how they were going to lean more towards supporting the CCP, although they definitely did have some conflicts between Mao Zedong, who was going to become the Chinese leader of the CCP, and the Soviet views of how the Civil War should be carried out from the communists. Mao Zedong came onto the scene, and you can see some information about him if you look at the yellow box at the top of page 261. You can see that he had a peasant background, although his family was definitely in a better financial position than other peasant families. He then left to study and became educated, and in his education began to learn principles of Marxism and even anarchist principles as well. He agreed with a lot of the philosophies of these principles that he was learning, especially Marxism. So when he moved back to the province of Hunan, which is where he was from, he began to develop his ideas and philosophy more and refine them, became a leader of a trade union organization, and also showed his skills at organizing the peasantry. When he realized that the peasant support could be more significant and more influential in getting China on the direction that he wanted, he began a basic shift away from just relying on workers to relying more so on the peasants. Both groups had initially supported the CCP even back during the Northern Expedition to rid China of the warlords, but now Mao really felt like it was most important to focus on the peasants. In 1931, he was elected the chairman of the Central Executive Committee of the CCP. But it did definitely take some time and some struggles for him to consolidate his complete power over the party, which he ended up doing throughout the course of the Chinese Civil War. So I just really want to emphasize the role of peasants in how the course of the Chinese Civil War was going to play out. From Mao's point of view, they were the most important to focus on. You can see the statistics of the population in China if you look on page 261. In the first main paragraph. Their population at that time in 1927 was about 500 million, which is more than what the U.S. has today. So you can see the huge population even at that time. And it says there that only 12% were in urban areas, whereas 88% lived in rural regions. And then from a total workforce of approximately 259 million, 205 million were agricultural workers, and a mere 54 million were non-agricultural or industrial workers. So that's why it explains why Mao felt that it was really important to concentrate on the peasant base of support for his operations in charge of the CCP. The idea of focusing specifically on the peasants shows a definite shift away from traditional Orthodox Marxism, which started with the Russian Revolution, where they were focusing on the workers. You can look at the sidebar on 261 that the actual term Soviet, I mean, we know Russia became the Soviet Union, but Soviet itself means a workers' council, and that's who the Russians focused on in their revolution and who ended up taking control in the communist government. It was the idea of the proletariat, the working class, whereas here with Mao, he was focusing mostly on the peasantry. Unfortunately for Mao, there was a lot of division within the Chinese Communist Party and some division in the GMD too as well at this point. You can see what Mao's main points were on page 261, his views. Those 3 bullet points at the bottom of 261, and again, emphasizing how he felt the peasant masses would be the ones that would direct this revolution. They would be mobilized and politicized. They would use guerrilla tactics as opposed to conventional strategies. And throughout the process, land reforms would be continually implemented, and peasants would see a direct outcome to their efforts, and they would see the benefits of it. The Soviet Union at this point was definitely supporting the CCP to the point of directing them and giving them orders with what to do. They had also done this with the GMD before the CCP emerged onto the scene. Comintern stands for Communist International, and this was an organization which was started in the Soviet Union with the Russian Revolution, but Comintern's main goal was to direct communist operations and revolutions in other countries throughout the world. Comintern was convinced that with the beginning of the 1930s, which was the introduction of the Great Depression, that the world was ripe for communist revolution and that these could be successfully implemented in many countries throughout the world. So it was in Comintern's interest to send officials to different countries that were on the verge of rebellions and civil wars to try to influence those wars with communism so that they could have an outcome of communism in the end. The man who was appointed as Comintern official in China for the CCP was a man by the name of Li Lisan. He actually gave some orders in how the first stage of the civil war between the GMD and the CCP should be fought. He told the CCP to target cities in their attacks. However, this was very unsuccessful. The CCP was pretty much shattered within the main cities of China. This obviously showed that Comintern had some shortcomings when it came to understanding the dynamics at force within China and how the war would best be fought and won to produce a victory for the communists. Li Lisan was dismissed from his leadership in 1931, and if you can see on the sidebar on 262 in the yellow, a new group of people came to power to direct operations for the CCP as they continued their civil war against the GMD. These were known as the 28 Bolsheviks. These were basically college graduates that joined up with the Comintern, and they were strong enough to get rid of Mao as their main obstacle. At that point, he was the chief commissar of the Red Army, and he had kind of built his way up into the CCP, but these 28 Bolsheviks who took over for Li Lisan dismissed him, and they were able to direct CCP operations. However, Mao Zedong was able to show that his strategies were better than what these 28 Bolsheviks were advocating. So Mao Zedong, in the beginning parts of the Chinese Civil War, really had to prove himself, and it ended up showing that his philosophy and his techniques would definitely be more successful than what the Soviets were directing them to do. He had a better understanding of the situation in China, and it's definitely of the role of the peasantry and the impact that they could give. So now let's turn our attention to what the GMD was doing at this point. We've kind of been talking about the CCP and how they were trying to organize themselves, but we do know from the last recording that the GMD had pursued the CCP into the mountains. Jiang Jieshi, he was the leader of the GMD at this point, and we had said before that he hadn't really been successful at the time that the Northern Expedition took place in removing the warlords from China. He hadn't really been successful in carrying out Sun Yat-sen's 3 principles. Even at this point, at the beginning of the Chinese Civil War, he hadn't really carried them out either. He had some attempts, but they were all ineffective. And you can see some reasons for this on page 262. Basically, there was no real progress towards democracy, similar to the Double Tenth Revolution. They had wanted to overthrow the Manchu dynasty and establish a Chinese republic, but in the end, no real changes were made to the government structure. So at this point, Jiang Jieshi had failed in instituting any types of democratic reforms, which was part of the 3 principles. Land reform was very limited to maybe a few schools because most of the support base for Jiang Jieshi and the GMD came from landlords and the wealthy class of society, unlike the CCP, who was mostly supported by lower class industrial workers and especially, now we know, the peasants. Another threat that GMD had to face at this point, because they were considered to be the more powerful of the 2 groups and somewhat of who controlled the government in China at this point, Japan invaded the province of Manchuria, which is in northeastern China, in 1931, which is something that we'll discuss a lot in the causes of World War II. It was the beginning of the Japanese government really seeking an empire in the Pacific. It's also when they withdrew themselves from the League of Nations and just set about a conquest of Asia for the most part. So Jiang Jieshi had to address that concern while trying to implement his 3 principles within the country of China and get rid of the communists all at the same time. So there wasn't a whole lot of success initially for Jiang Jieshi. But he did try to continue to target the communists, just like he did with his purification movements and the White Terror. He began what was known as the 5 Encirclement campaigns, which the goal was to cut off the Red Army, which was the CCP fighting force, from any of their supplies. If he could destroy the Jiangxi Soviet region and the CCP itself, then he could further his goals of becoming the legitimate government of China and with himself in power. So with the GMD attacks focused on the Hunan and Jiangxi provinces, which is where the CCP were known to have ran off to, they continually tried to engage in onslaught attacks similar to the purification movements. But Mao and his communist forces of the Red Army pretty much just decided to hole up in the mountainous regions and try to build up their military force while hiding themselves and pretty much develop a very strong operations base to work from. You can look at a quote by Mao Zedong and trying to explain his strategy to the Comintern officials. You can see he says, "The enemy advances, we retreat. The enemy halts, we harass. The enemy tires, we attack. The enemy retreats, we pursue." It's a very guerrilla warfare style approach. And this was done in other wars as well. If you think of the Vietnam War, this is the strategy that the Viet Cong had towards U.S. soldiers coming into their country. The Viet Cong had very extensive knowledge of the land and built series of tunnels in what was known as the Ho Chi Minh Trail. The U.S. had really no knowledge of the land and could not combat that effectively. In China's situation, the communists knew these provinces inside and out. They were able to establish this base in the mountainous area. The GMD did not have as big of a base in this region and therefore could not effectively battle the communists as well. So by Mao showing himself to be successful in keeping the CCP from being completely obliterated, more support and belief was given to his strategies of using the peasants and guerrilla-style tactics. However, there was still some disagreement between Mao and Comintern officials, and again, that's why he continually had to prove himself and his strategies for being effective. Eventually, he would do so and regain full control over the CCP and direct their operations from that point. In these 5 encirclement campaigns, in the first 3, Mao and another man that he was working with, who was more an organizer of industrial workers before, Zhao Enlai, who would be a very influential person when the Chinese government was solidified under Mao's control in 1949. The two of them faced stronger GMD forces in the first 3 of these encirclement campaigns, and each time, even though they faced greater numbers, they defeated the GMD at each point. The reason they do that was because of Mao's strategies of revolutionary war. We've already introduced this idea of guerrilla tactics and just hiding out and tiring out the enemy, that war of attrition viewpoint. And you can also see that if you look on page 262 above the student study section, that basically what Mao did was allow GMD forces to enter the territories in these provinces. He would allow them to begin rounding up communists, and then from that point, the GMD officials and army were kind of fragmented across the areas. That's when the CCP would hit them with hit-and-run attacks. Because of the knowledge of the land that they had, they could quickly attack and then hide. And so this strategy is what allowed them to have success in the first 3 campaigns. The same strategy was used in the 4th encirclement campaign, which Mao was not officially a part of, but the same strategies that he had used in the first 3 were applied in the 4th. Therefore, another success was seen by the CCP. So even though they were facing outnumbered forces, their knowledge of the land and use of guerrilla-style hit-and-run tactics is what allowed them to survive and avoid being obliterated in these encirclement campaigns. So Mao definitely proved himself of having a good philosophy of how to fight the war with guerrilla strategies, but also using the peasantry around the countryside to give refuge and supplies and overall support to the Red Army of the CCP. The successes of Mao's strategy, his philosophy, is what gave him a lot of credibility and what allowed him to consolidate his power of the CCP. You can definitely see there's a lot of comparisons here between their strategies and philosophy and other wars like I've mentioned with Vietnam. Even the American Revolutionary War, some of the colonists used these types of tactics in combating the British and to some extent allowed them to defeat the British in the end. We'll discuss the next major event in the first phase of the Chinese Civil War, which is the Long March, in the next recording.